Hi, I'm Tim. Join me in this video as we go from this Dumas kit of the Aeronca C-3 to this. Let's get to it. The Aeronca C-3 was an outgrowth of the earlier Aeronca C-2. The C-2 was a light personal aircraft built by the Aeronca Corporation in 1931. The idea was to provide extremely inexpensive airplanes for civilian pilots. It was obviously the beginning of the Depression, and the original C-2 just had seated one pilot. The pilot literally sat on a plywood floor. Very basic instrumentation. It had an altimeter, a tachometer, an oil pressure gauge, and an oil temperature gauge. That was it. The plane that we'll be building, or I'll be building in this video, is the C-3. That came out in 1935. It was a little bit bigger than the C-2, and then it allowed for two pilots to sit side by side, so you could have a little bit more flight instruction. It was still a very basic airplane. It sold for $1,900 in 1935. The extras that you could pay extra for if you wanted included brakes and wingtip lightings. That's how basic it was, but it provided an entry for people to fly, and with two people they could learn how to fly. A total of 430 of the Aeronca C-3s were built. Production had to cease in the end of the 1930s. Federal government started putting on safety restrictions or requirements for aircraft. The Aeronca just didn't have that in terms of bracing for its wings. The aforementioned flight instrumentation, it did not even have an airspeed indicator, and it just had to cease production. They couldn't redesign it to do that. The existing C-3s were grandfathered in, so they're still allowed to fly, but it was a popular airplane at the time. The Aeronca C-3 has always been on my to-do list for an RC model. It's a little bit tricky to build just due to the nature of the triangular fuselage construction. The good news is Dumas Kits has a model of C-3. It's designed by Pat Trittle, who's probably one of the most accomplished electric model airplane designers out there. And if Pat has designed the model, it should be a good model. So let's take a look at the kit, unbox the kit, and take a look at the kit. This is the kit box as it came in the mail. It's really a mailing container in addition to a kit box. I ordered online directly from Dumas Models. The link will be in the description for this, and it came in the mail no problem. So opening the kit box, this is what you get. It's literally a pile of balsa. We have the laser cut parts here, which look very nice. You can see the outline of the laser cut parts. And then the balsa to build the fuselage. Again, just a bunch of balsa parts. The balsa is lightweight, it's very high quality. I'm very encouraged by looking at that. There's acetate for the windshields. There's tissue covering, which I'll not use for this model because I'll be using heat shrink covering for my model. There are several bags of equipment to include rigging wire, wheels, which is a very nice thing to have, some laser cut control horns, tubes to mount the wings, in addition to some other hardware, music wire for the airplane. This is the plastic. It's a weird, almost cardboard type plastic. It's almost cardboard. It's a very lightweight plastic. This will be for the cowl. And some patterns for the windshield, cockpit side fairing. So all in all, a very good kit. Now let's take a look at the plans. And again, Pat Trittle did these plans. If Pat did it, it's going to be complete. And these are just classic model airplane plans. The wings, the fuselage, all this here. And again, because of the triangular cross-section of the fuselage, it's going to be tricky to build, and I'll get into more detail on that later, just how we're going to tackle that. But a very good set of plans. This is sheet number 1. It's located right here. So again, fuselage side view, top view, and a lot of isometric details of how to do things on the model to include the jigs, which we'll get to here in a second. Also, when this model was designed, it was designed in 2006. Back then, it was before the common era of brushless electric motors and lightweight lithium polymer batteries. So lightweight was the key. The original model Pat designed was about 6 ounces, which is incredibly lightweight. So we'll have a little bit more room to play with on this because I'll put in a brushless motor and lithium polymer batteries. I don't know what motor yet. I'll have to do some research on that. The other thing I want to point out is Dumas does provide instruction manuals for the C3. Now, they're detailed manuals, but it's just a bunch of assembly steps for a model that's not following a normal assembly process. The wing is 16 steps for each wing half and so forth. The good news on this is that there is a very complete photo illustrated construction guide of the Aeronca on RC Groups. And what I've done here is on my iPad, I've downloaded this page. The link will be in the description. And this is a step-by-step guide by Pat himself of the building. And you can see that the pictures blow up. And they're very nice pictures that show how to do things. You can see the jig located here, things of that nature. So I'll be using the instructions supplied with the kit as well as that online guide to build it. Let's take a quick look at the online guide on my computer. This is the article on RC Groups from Pat Trittle himself, the designer of how to build a model. Very good pictures. You can enlarge them on your computer. There's discussion from Pat as well as other commentators on the site. It's a great backup to the written instructions for how to build this model using the jig. You can see the fuselage former being built here, the fuselage in the jig, and so forth. These videos detail the construction of the fuselage, a very good isometric drawing of the jig for the fuselage. It's absolutely critical to put this together to properly align the fuselage. Again, very simple. The directions show where everything should go. And the first step of the fuselage is you build the bottom of the fuselage. You can see this here on the plan. Once this simple bottom is completed, it's simply put in place onto the jig, cracked as necessary to bend up for the rear portion of it. And then the fuselage is, the formers themselves go into the jig, and the jig sets up the proper angle for the fuselage. There's some unusual components due to the nature of the C3 construction, the wing jig, frame assemblies, aft fuselage formers. Side of the fuselage, they all make sense. You can see the fuselage outlined. You put them in place on the jig at the proper angle, and everything goes together very nicely. So here's today's progress. So the fuselage, before going into detail on this, I wanted to point out a few things on the plans. The instruction book actually is pretty good. There are no pictures with it. I mentioned the pictures online. This is a pretty good set of information to build the airplane. I want to point out also that there is a parts location for all the laser cut parts. It's numbered or labeled here. They are not labeled on the various balsa sheets. But I've just gone through all the steps, and I'm probably about 3/4 of the way through the fuselage. I want to point out also that the plans are very detailed. It's just an unusual model to build, which you can see with the jig here. And to understand how to build the model, the fuselage is actually drawn 3 times. Here you have just a very rough outline of the fuselage with the jig locations here. So you see how it builds on the jig. There is a second fuselage that is the fuselage main frame assembly. This is what is built in the jig. I'm just about done with this portion here. You can see the wing goes on top here eventually. Then finally, there is a third drawing of the fuselage, which is a completed fuselage with a cowl, electric motor, wheels, all the other stuff on here. Just so there's so many layers of construction, they want to put that on the plan. So it's a very good set of plans, very complete. Note also the plans are blank on the back side, so it's very easy to trim them so they can handle it a little bit easier. So this is the fuselage so far. This is the all-important jig that I mentioned earlier that goes in place. And you follow the instructions, it builds up bit by bit in the jig. It's a very lightweight construction. It's not a robust, strong construction because it's an electric-powered model for brushed motors at the time. I'll probably add a few reinforcements here and there to make it a little bit stronger once I'm done. But so far, the jig is a key to everything to make sure that it's true and everything matches up. So far so good, and we'll finish up the fuselage tomorrow, I think. I reached a stopping point on the fuselage, so here it is right now. Let me describe what I mean by a stopping point. So, very happy with the directions. If you follow them step by step and make sure you know what you're doing based on the plans, it goes together well. There's just good illustrations of the plans in the instruction guide, and the construction jig is very helpful. So now we can take it out of the jig. We don't really need the jig anymore. Some things I want to point out is I'm at a stopping point because I have to next put on the power and control system before I continue covering the fuselage or completing the fuselage. So the power system is exactly what I'm going to use in the Spitfire. That had tons of power, and all the details will be in the description. So I will replicate that power system in here. So I've got to put in the firewall, figure out how far out the engine has to go for the cowling, all those standard things with the installation. But what I want to point out is I don't want to put in the stringers on the top and the bottom here until I have the engine installed, the reinforcements on the firewall, where I'm going to put the servos, the control rod runs, and the receiver and the electronic speed control. Once all that is in place or situated, then I can start putting in the covering on the bottom to include the landing gear a little bit in the back to be ready for covering it. You don't want to have all that structure on the side. You just can't get access inside the fuselage. The other thing I want to point out is I've said all along, when Pat Trittle, who's a master designer, designed this, he wanted a model as lightweight as possible for the very low power geared brushed systems at the time, NiCad batteries. And so what had happened, the structure is certainly light, but it can be fragile. So what I've done, what I recommend you might consider, is I put little braces here where the formers and other pieces just butt join up. These are just square balsa that I've CA'd in place. Here, where the front of the wing is mounted, I put these triangular braces here of scrap balsa along here. That's just going to make it a stronger structure, because once it's covered and these things start snapping off, because it's just a butt glue joint and it might not be that strong, it's very hard to fix without opening up the covering and things like that. So this, I'm very happy with the fuselage. It came out just the way it's supposed to. I think it'll look nice once it's covered. Get the electronics fitted, and then we'll continue with the wing and tail surfaces. These are the plans for the wingtip laminations, two 1/16 inch by 3 16th inch balsa. You wet the balsa. I use foam board for the outline, CA glue to glue them, and they came out pretty nice. So here they are after they dry, remove them from the former. Be a little bit more bending, but this is where they go into place on the fuselage, the wing tips. The wings are very normal construction. Here the right panel is in place. It's a delicate construction to keep things light. You may have to add a little bit more structure, your call, but the wing goes together pretty nice. A little bit of extra bracing where the rigging wires will go. In this view, you can see the dry fit of the wing mount. It goes onto the top of the fuselage and the frame in front. And there are metal tubes supplied with the kit that supply the wing halves, connect the wing halves together. I decided to glue everything to one unit. I think that'll be okay for a small model of this size. As you saw in the previous videos, as I was building, the wings went together pretty good, and here is the fuselage with the wings just mounted in place. I've not glued anything in. So the way the wings went together pretty well. If you follow the instructions, I don't think there's any surprises. It's a little bit of an unusual construction technique, because again, the designer, Pat Trittle, is trying to save every bit of weight possible. So some of the ribs, for example, will have cutout sections with 1/16 inch balsa below. It saves minimal weight, but it's just follow the directions. The die cutting is very good. It goes together well. Now, what happens is, in the instructions, you have metal tubes that go in the center section and each wing, so the wings slide off and on. What I have elected to do is, when I complete my model, I am going to have the wing be completely glued in one piece, glued onto the fuselage. I think in the long run, to glue everything on, to keep the alignment, especially with the rigging that will be in place, the thread rigging for the airplane, it's not that big an airplane. It's about a 40-inch wingspan. So it's just going to be easier to glue everything together, glue it on the fuselage. You got to think ahead a little bit about that. I think I'll cover each wing panel, join it together, mount it to the fuselage, cover that section, but we'll work on that when we get to that point. So again, the key thing is, because of the triangular fuselage, this wing mounting system works out pretty good. So it just goes on just like this, and then I'll very easily be able to put some balsa reinforcement to keep all that strong. So that came out pretty good. So I'm happy about that. Now the other thing I wanted to point out is the electronics. So these, and all the specifics of electronics will be in the description. Standard high-tech HS40 servos, small, lightweight, they work fine. I'll use the little AR410 receiver. It's a 4-channel receiver. Again, I love the bind button here on the Spectrum receiver. That works fine. Also, as a reminder, what's really nice about this receiver is the antenna is built inside. There's no wire antenna. That's just one less thing to go wrong when you're building it, the antenna placement. Now, here's a motor I intend to use. I think this is a Park 250. I'm really not sure. I have to do some research. But this will fit well. And what I've done is, on the side view, I just placed the motor like this. And you see it fits on quite well onto the side view. The other thing are the cowl. And you can see that it should fit inside this cowl, just barely fit okay. So I think the motor, while it will provide tons of power, I'll just keep the throttle low. And notice I have to build it out about a 1/2 inch from the firewall. So it'll be something like this, about a 1/2 inch out to fit inside the cowling. I'll use my standard popsicle mounts for that. And then it just just uses the screws to connect to the firewall at that point. So far we're in pretty good shape. The plane's gone together well. The instructions are good. Now, the other thing I want to mention are the tail surfaces. You'll notice that the plane's built up, obviously, and here are the shaped over the formers for the wingtips. The directions have you doing the same thing for the tail surfaces, both the vertical and horizontal tail surfaces, just for ease of construction and the fact that I'm going to be covering it with heat shrink tubing. If I have an open framework, there's a good chance of warpage. I'm just going to use 1/16 inch, lightweight 1/16 inch balsa for the stabilizer, elevator, fin, and rudder, and that should work out fine. So that'll be my plan going forward. This shows some detail of the fuselage with the landing gear in place. The cowl halves are glued together. And the next step is to mount the engine the proper distance forward. I just used some scrap balsa to mount the engine on, and that went together fairly well. Just have to check it to the plans as you do this portion of the build. The servos are in place for the elevator and rudder. And next step is to do the receiver and ESC. This is a bit off topic. I was out walking today and a B-17 flew overhead. Let's take a look. Back to the C-3. Made good progress on the C-3 fuselage. So you can see here the fuselage. These very lightweight wheels come with a kit. It's really rather nice. They're cardboard covers. They're not super robust, but they're certainly lightweight and they're the right size. That's the important thing for any model. So we'll take these off for now. The landing gear has been installed, and it's 3 assemblies: the main gear, the rear, and the front bracing struts. And what I did was I used a little bit of thread and CA glue to bind that in place with epoxy, originally hold it into place. When you have 3 struts in the back, the front, and the middle one, they all bind together. It's a surprisingly strong structure. You really don't need it anywhere near this thick. This is what came with the kit. If I were to do it again, I'd have it a little bit thinner. But that's, I think, a good, robust gear assembly for this lightweight model. Here's my motor, about a 1/2 inch extension. I just used some scrap balsa to build that out with plywood on the front, plywood on the back. screws holding it in place, then washers to account for the down and right thrust. This is the cowl, and the cowl is going to fit on something like that. Now, one thing that's characteristic of the Aeronca is the center line thrust of the motor is really quite high. It should be a little bit higher. If I were to do that, these mounting holes would be outside the outline of the cowl itself. There is a possibility of trimming those to have it. I'm just not going to go there. So what I did was I enlarged the front just a little bit. So the circle is going to be a little bit bigger than normal to account for the fact that the center line of the prop is a little bit lower than on the actual model. It's just the way it came out. So that's something I've chosen to live with, and we'll do that. We'll do that with the model, and the cowl will be glued on once everything is done. I've included the 2 servos with their connecting hardware. I think balsa rails are enough for a small model like that. Screws hold it in place, and here are the wire tubes that go out to the back for the elevator and rudder. So far it's coming along pretty well. The next thing will be to put in the rest of the electronics, the rest of the balsa framing, make this a little bit stronger for the wing mount, glue the wing together, then we'll be ready to cover it. The fuselage is complete now with the internal components, the receiver and ESC. Now I can put the outside stringers, everything internal is in place. I am done with the major construction of the C3. So here's the wing. As I mentioned before, just to keep everything aligned with incidences so I don't have a twisted connection here, I've decided to make it one piece. I'll cover each wing, leave this open, glue this onto the fuselage, reinforce it, then cover this center section. I think that will be best. The spars are glued in place here. I added another spar on top, and hopefully that'll be strong enough for the wing. These are the tail surfaces. As I mentioned, I'll be doing those from 1/16 inch balsa. So those are all done here. Be sure with the elevator you have some reinforcement for the connection across the 2 elevator halves. This is the fuselage. So this is done. The motor's in place. All the electronics are in, a shelf for the battery, the servo. As I mentioned before, it's very important that you get all the guts inside the airplane before you add the outer portion. It's just too hard to fiddle around with it if this is already in place. So I'm happy everything fits inside there. I paid attention to the center of gravity because the motor is a little bit heavy for a small motor like this. Put the servos aft, and the battery here, it works out just about right with a 4-channel receiver down here. Center of gravity is located right here per the plans. So the tubes are in place. Essentially, it's all ready to cover. I did do a little bit of strengthening. Notice here they just had a single 1/8 by 1/16 inch for the for the forward frame. I put on reinforcements front and back, the little side pieces here because it's an open cockpit, and that's what I did. But it's a pretty strong little fuselage. Everything went together well. I'm happy. The one other thing I want to point out for the stabilizer and back, I built a little shelf with 2 other reinforcement balsa, just a little bit more area to glue that on. The plans just have it on top, just this one, I think 3/32 inch square balsa. It's just not enough area in my opinion. So I think we're all set. I'll do some finishing sanding tomorrow, and I think we're ready to start covering it. I've decided to cover it with a transparent yellow. I've seen a couple examples on the web of yellow C3s that look kind of nice. The other thing is kind of funny. When I opened up the kit, going through everything, I couldn't find any decals. I said, oh, it's too bad. The decals would make it look nice. I was reading through the directions the second time, and it mentioned the decals. Well, the decals were stuck inside the kit box, so I've got out the decals. These are very nice decals. They're not the water decals. You pull them off. It's the sticky back decals with a little Aeronca thing, the number here. So I think that'll look nice when it's on the finished model. Good progress with the covering today. I used transparent park light covering. Usually the transparent iron-on coverings are a little bit lighter than the solid coverings, but I thought for this model with the structure it'd be kind of nice to see through it, and so I picked it all yellow. There's a couple of pictures on the web of Aeroncas with all yellow. So here's the wing. I put the decals on the front and the back. They come in the kit. And I'm going to leave this center portion open because with the fuselage, when this goes in place like this, so the wing is in place like that, and what will happen is, as I get towards that stage, I'm going to glue the wing in place of the fuselage, and there'll be various corner braces here to make sure that it's on there as strong as possible. I'll probably put some balsa wood up here, as I mentioned, to glue the wing in place. I think that's going to be easier in the long run. So good progress so far. This will be that. Put the cowling on at that time, and I think it's come out pretty good. Looking forward to finishing up here in the near future and taking it for a test flight. This is a little bit of an aside to the main video. You can see the Dumas kit is the Aeronca C-3. It's very clear that it's C-3. As I've done research on this, I'm pretty sure this is a C-2, okay? The C-2 was the initial variation in the early 1930s. It was a single-place airplane, had about a 26 to 28 horsepower engine, and more importantly, it had the diamond back here and the 3 struts to the landing gear. The follow-on, the C-3, was actually built for 2 people, a pilot and a passenger. It was wider. It had a distinctive flatter top back, more of a turtle deck, and the landing gear was just a single strut going out. I'll show a picture of what the C-3 looks like. You can see that. Not the end of the world. They both look very similar, but I'm pretty sure this is a C-2. I've completed the C-3 here, and I think the kit came out pretty well. The instructions were good. I just followed them through, took my time, made sure whatever was in the instructions I could understand on the plans, and the plane went together well. The wing feels pretty solid on here. I've added some of the rigging wires. I think that adds to the effect. Painted the front cowling and located the center of gravity. I had to put a few fishing weights in the nose to keep the center of gravity forward. The tail got just a little bit heavier than I had planned, but that's okay. And I'm pleased with the way it came out. I think it's going to be a good little kit. So the next thing is to wait for weather. We'll take it for a test flight out in the field. But before we do that, let's just take a look at the controls. I will hitch up the battery. The directions gives the desired control throws about ½ inch up, down, left, right. So up, down, left, right. And then the motor has plenty of thrust. That should be good for this model. So very happy with the way it came out, and the next step is a test flight at the field. All right, so we're out here at the field. Looks like a pretty good day with our good friend Leo that we're meeting here. And we'll give the Aeronca a test flight to see how it goes. Wish me luck. The first flight went very well. There's plenty of power. Luckily, it tracks straight. You need a large size rudder to keep it turning. I would recommend for the initial flights to keep your speed up. It will tend to drop a wing if you get too slow, but the more you practice and get comfortable with the flight characteristics, it's a good flying model. As always, double, triple check that your wing is warp free before any flights. We just got done with our 2 test flights of the Aeronca C-3, C-2, and I'm very happy. It took off well, it tracks straight, the engine's got plenty of power, the rudder has got plenty of authority for turning as well as the elevators. You notice the wings are pretty long and thin. That was because of the low horsepower of the original engine. It just needed a lot of lift to go along. And the plane flies well. You can see on the landings, the minute you slow down, you start losing the bank control. So you're going to have to land a little bit faster than normal. But is a very predictable flyer, very enjoyable to fly. I look forward to doing more experiments and flights with it to learn it, but so far so good. We're literally back from the flying field of the test flights of the Aeronca, and you can see from the flights, I couldn't be any happier the way this thing flew. It's a cute little model. We've gone through the construction. It goes together well. You just have to pay attention to what you're doing. The plans are incredibly complete. They're just incredibly complete. The instructions are very complete. Just take it step by step. You get a nice flying model. It took off fine. With the long wings, it flew fine. I will be honest, when you get slow, I'm still exploring how it's going to handle when it slows down. So you can see both landings, it kind of plunked on. Have to fly it on for now. There are no ailerons, so you're utterly dependent on the rudder for keeping the wings level. And surprisingly, when you read pilot reports of how the real C-3s and C-2s flew, you really had to pay attention to the rudder. The ailerons just weren't that effective on the real thing. So that being said, it's good that it's a huge rudder. That works fine. I will learn how to fly it. Just keep your speed up until you get things squared away. But overall, it's just a very attractive model. It looks nice, flies nice in the air. I'm looking forward to further flights on that. The one other thing I do want to point out for anybody contemplating this kit, in an effort to make the model as light as possible, Pat Trittle, the designer, saved weight wherever he could. As a result, the wing doesn't have a second spar, which would probably be a good idea to prevent twists from being built in. The good news is with a heat shrink covering, you just have to look at the wing before you fly and make sure that it's flat. And if you have to twist it the opposite direction with a heat gun, shrink that loosened covering to make it flat, it's absolutely essential that you have the wings flat on both sides, no twist warps that are built in. That is a must-do for any flights that you may have. But other than that, I think it's a great kit. I don't recommend building the ailerons or something like that. It's going to add a lot of weight. The rudder works fine for this model, and I look forward to more flights with this.